Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here at the Chicago Humanities Festival, which is an amazing institution and a real inspiration to all of us who work in the academic humanities. I'm very privileged to be here and to be able to speak to you about my recent book, Bleak Liberalism, which was published by the University of Chicago Press. The main argument of the book is that throughout its history, liberalism, as both a political philosophy and a lived political commitment, has been characterized by a tension between skepticism and hope. Now, it is often a tendency, and I would say particularly within the academy, to see liberalism as, at best, naively optimistic, and at worst, as a tool of capitalist ideology. But the argument of my book is that throughout its history, liberalism has manifested a tragic and self-aware dimension, one that is sober, chastened, bleak, very aware of all the barriers to its actualization. And you see this especially in times of crisis. So I would say one of the punctual moments for the book is the post-war era, after World War II, when many liberals in the United States and Europe were trying to come to terms with what they saw as the catastrophes of the 20th century: war, fascism, the disappointment of the Soviet experiment. But it's also the case that this aspect of liberalism has been enduring throughout its history, and my book focuses in particular on the 19th and the 20th centuries. The second point I want to make before I sort of get started is that the form of liberalism that I'm going to speak to you about this evening is what is generally called political liberalism, and it must be distinguished from classical economic liberalism, which has a strong attachment to the idea of an unfettered free market and a very strong investment in the individual's freedom from the state. The political liberalism, which I'm going to talk to you about, is very distinct from that, and it emerged pretty quickly after early liberalism as people committed to the principles of equality and freedom realized that you would need an active state in order to ensure self-actualization for all. So I just want to make that point up front so that people aren't thinking about classical economic liberalism when I'm speaking, though you should be thinking about it a little, and it'll come up a little bit later. Now, there are three key contexts that this talk is really speaking to. The first is how liberalism is seen within the humanities in the university. And in some ways, this talk is going to be a window on the landscape of debate within the university. And for those of you who are not in the university, I'm hoping that it will be useful and interesting to have a sense of some of the debates going on within the universities. The second context is liberalism in the larger political arena, how liberalism is seen, how it is framed, how it is dismissed, and how that plays into the question of trying to reconstruct or reconsider liberalism for the current times. And the third context is how liberalism finds voice in literature, and in particularly within the tradition of the novel throughout the 19th century and the 20th century in both realism and modernism. Now, I think it will perhaps deepen the relevance of what I'm going to say if people keep in mind the current challenges of democracy. I've just put a rather selective list up there, but I think we would all agree that democracy is in crisis, not only in the US, but elsewhere in the world. And some of the key challenges include diminished civic participation, polarization of debate, erosion of norms of evidence via alternative facts or fake news, and some really serious socio-political conditions and challenges, including structural racism, income inequality, deregulation, and an alarming rise of white nationalism. Now, I'd like to begin just by characterizing liberalism so that we have a basis from which to begin. So I've just put up 3 features of the political liberalism that I am interested in and the way it has been articulated by some really powerful liberal thinkers. So the first element is that it's a political philosophy founded on principles of equality, freedom, and human autonomy. The second aspect of it that I want to stress is that it entails a belief in institutions, procedure, progressive reform, and deliberative processes leading to punctual moments of decision, such as voting, consensus, or compromise. And the third feature is that it is often adduced or referred to as a frame of mind, as in the phrase, the liberal temperament, one that is open, tolerant, rational, and reflective. Now, this last element I'm going to be challenging a little bit with my emphasis on bleakness of attitude. So you will not see the same kind of liberal who appears to have a certain equanimity in the portraits that I will be showing you. So why bleak? Why the word bleak? You know, one might say realistic liberalism, or a liberalism that has a broader conception of challenges. Why this particular strong word, bleak? Well, one, I think it captures one's attention. I think that it makes one pay attention to hear that kind of strong attitudinal descriptor. But the other reason for the title of my book is that it is an allusion to Charles Dickens' 1853 novel, Bleak House, which I'm hoping some of you have read. Now, the really interesting thing about Bleak House is that it is an astonishingly experimental novel for 1853. It alternates between an omniscient third-person narrative and a first-person narrative by a young woman. So rather than some of the multi-narration novels that you see in the late 19th century and up and through modernism, which sort of, you know, clearly show you that everything is perspectival, this novel very strangely alternates between what is, you know, presented as a kind of objective, systemic view and this young woman's voice. And what's really, you know, my argument about what's going on in that novel is that we're being asked to think between and move back and forth between this view of the system, and the third-person narration is written in the simple present, which is a very strange tense. It has a kind of airless feel, and it is basically presenting a searing diagnosis of institutional corruption, power, suspicion, malevolence, self-interest, while the first-person narration is very hopeful and aspirational and imagines that we might be able to, you know, encourage moral values to radiate out from, you know, individual relations to the family, to the society. And I think this novel is essentially capturing this dialectic of skepticism and hope that I see as animating the history of liberalism since its inception. Now, liberalism at present is largely a pejorative term. And the irony is that it is a pejorative term used by both the Republican right and the academic left. It's refused by both sides. So from the Republican right, you see things like liberal media, meant to be extremely dismissive, liberal policies, bleeding heart liberal. These seemingly more neutral terms on the second bullet point are used in the academy, but they're meant to capture liberalism as an ideological formation that is in the service of capitalism and empire, so that whenever you see liberalism as a modifier, it is typically being used as an attempt to identify and indict ideology linked to capitalism. The third point that needs to kind of be kept in mind when you're thinking about how liberalism is considered and framed in the contemporary landscape is the importance and prevalence of the term neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism is a very real and powerful thing. It denotes the attempt to extend market logic throughout all of society, and the attempt to diminish programs associated with the welfare state, progressive tax structures, and regulation of corporate and financial institutions so that they cannot operate without restraint to multiply profits. It is seen as both a frame of mind and an actual economic reality that has produced income inequality and many of the problems of privatization at the present time. It's a very real thing. The diagnosis of it is important, but it has tarnished with its brush the perception of liberalism itself. And this is really something that I would argue strenuously against. Neoliberalism is not liberalism. Neoliberalism is a metastasized form of economic liberalism. It is not political liberalism. And I think it's really important for people to bear that in mind as they consider the contemporary political landscape. So given these problems with terminology, why insist on using the term, on attempting to defend the term, promote the term? Why would one do this? Why not substitute a different word? Why not just say progressive, as the political strategist and linguist George Lakoff has done in his many books directed at both democratic strategists and democratic well-meaning citizens, just trying to kind of not even touch that third rail, which is the word liberal. Or why not talk of democracy rather than liberalism? Maybe that's like safer and easier. My argument would be that liberalism has a robust intellectual tradition, one that has permeated many forms of literature and art. And to simply try to evade that or to pretend that it's better not to use the term seems to me a mistake, and it doesn't do justice to this very robust tradition. The radical tradition has a very robust intellectual tradition that begins with Marx and radiates throughout all of his heirs. So does the liberal tradition, and I think that that has to be owned and embraced and promoted by people who believe in the promise of a liberal democracy. The other reason is that I think that liberalism, as I kind of mentioned before, is a felt commitment and a belief. It is not ideology just being channeled through unwitting subjects. So for that reason, because I want to present liberalism as a belief structure, and that's how it resonates with the theme of the Humanities Festival this year, I think that it's very important to use the word, since so many of the writers in the tradition have helped to generate an understanding of what that kind of belief structure looks like. So that may sound counterintuitive to some people. How can you talk about liberalism as a belief when it is the epitome of secular modernity, which involves a turn away from religion to reason? How can you talk about liberalism as a belief if it is basically the ideological cover for capitalism and empire, and hence has to be a form of bad faith and can't possibly be authentic belief? Alternately, isn't liberalism abstract, impersonal, thin as opposed to thick? And therefore, how can it possibly be seen as prompting the kind of existential, felt commitments that we associate with belief? Well, that is precisely, my wager and my argument, that liberalism has been elaborated as a belief, and it's actually something that one has to look at as a historical development and as something that gradually comes to infiltrate and penetrate habits and practices, thereby becoming a felt commitment. So, in my view, liberalism reconsiders is a belief, a commitment, a lived ideology, in the sense of an ideology that one reflectively endorses and does not simply imbibe from the culture. It is an aspiration amidst acknowledged counterforces. And I think it's very important to remember that all political beliefs, whether they're radical or liberal, are an aspiration. That, the ideals that animate political actors are typically seen as precisely that, ideals towards which one aspires. It's not as though they will simply be self-actualized. There's a tendency often to think of liberals as complacent and smug and apologists for the status quo. And my argument, again, is that just does not do justice to the thinkers and writers and actors within the liberal tradition. It's an always ongoing, incomplete project. And it requires active economic and social policies, as well as legal measures, to ensure the conditions of self-actualization for all. Now, the forms of challenge that I keep referring to were evident from the inception of liberalism, and John Stuart Mill, probably one of the most important 19th century liberals, was keenly aware of them. Most people are aware of his warnings against the tyranny of the majority in democracy, a kind of sociological concern that he had that was well-founded. But he had many, many other moments in his writings where he stressed how difficult it was going to be to promote liberalism as a political view. So one of the first and most important aspects of his sense of the challenges had to do with his keen awareness that what you wanted to do if you wanted to have a liberal democratic state was that you needed for people to care about abstract principles like justice, freedom, and equality. And they had to attach themselves to that idea. And that, of course, was, he said, how is this going to work? National cohesion has always been kind of promoted by people feeling like they're with like people in a state that has a national culture that can be described and that is based on language and ethnicity. So how are we going to get people to want to belong to a group that's committed to abstract principles of freedom, justice, inclusion? How's that going to work? And he was very aware of this, and he's quite eloquent about this in his wonderful essay on Samuel T. Coleridge. The other point that he was very aware of was that if you were going to try to challenge custom and get people to realize that certain customs that fed into hierarchies and privileges, if they were going to be challenged, you had to get people to routinely and habitually question authority, as the current or challenge authority, as some current statements say. And it had to be, as he said, you have to create a culture where that becomes more habitual. Now, just to give a present-day example, so most universities at the present time have developed or are in the midst of developing what are called diversity and inclusion action plans. So my university, Brown University, in 2015-16, required every department and every center and institute on the campus to develop its own diversity and inclusion action plan in conversation with stakeholders from all levels of the department or unit, including undergraduates, staff, faculty. Now, so I'm the director of an institute, and we underwent this process. And one of the things that we were doing, and I know many of my colleagues were doing this when they were working in other units in the university, we were trying to question whether some of our habitual practices, our most just unthinking default ways of being, ways of gathering, formats that we used for programming, ways we set up tables, whether they were in some ways making some people feel less included or, could be examined, with a new eye and with some idea that, well, this is a custom, is it a problem? Now, not all customs are problems. Sometimes they're customs for good reasons. But this is just I just give that as a kind of current day example of the kind of thing that Mill wanted people to be always actively engaged in. And I credit the administrators at my university for insisting that all of these plans be living documents that could be continually revised, because the idea is you don't know what you're going to think a year from now after you've instituted a few new policies to help with diversity and inclusion. And the other thing that Mill was really adamant about was the idea that there had to be a social, interactive, and dialogical basis for one's belief system, that it was extremely important that ideas and beliefs be debated. So he writes in On Liberty in 1859, on questions of morals and politics, one must learn the grounds of one's own opinion, by bringing counter-arguments into real contact with one's own mind and hear them from persons who actually believe them. So this was one of his key claims, and I think, first of all, just a couple points. He did not think this applied to science. I'll just leave it at that. So he's a smart guy. So, but he really felt that this was really important, this notion of a kind of a lived commitment to one's own ideas and one's own opinions. And this really flies in the face of assumptions that, that liberalism is arid and neutral as a philosophy. Okay, in the current climate, there is often a sense that liberalism is a problem because it denies or seeks to neutralize identity, which is to say that in having a kind of abstract conception of rights and having an abstract conception of the person or a universal conception of the person, that it somehow doesn't make room for or encompass really important identity affiliations and identity claims. So that, you know, rather than, that's denying identity rather than, you know, as Martin Luther King argues in the Dream speech, allowing for the full expression of individual character by making things like ascribed identity not matter, okay? So this is this quote from King, I'll just read. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." So this is one issue that's been kind of brought up as a key kind of criticism of liberalism, this idea that it denies or seeks to neutralize identity. On the other hand, you have people saying that identity politics and claims about who has authority to speak about which topics have actually stymied active debate about beliefs, and in particular, political beliefs or commitments. So you have what kind of looks like an impasse here. It looks like, on the one hand, liberalism is the foe of identity, and on the other hand, identity is the foe of liberalism. I think this is a kind of, it's an impasse. It often operates as an impasse in the cultural sphere, but I think it is conceived reductively and that it is unnecessary. So just to begin with, there is no reason why liberalism and debates around liberal concepts and principles and policies and aspirations can't also include discussions about the importance of affirmative relations to various identity affiliations, nor can it afford to exclude stringent critiques of the problems of ascribed identity, stereotyping, harmful conceptions of others that thwart their sense of well-being and their ability to self-actualize. So I think that that's just, there's a kind of false opposition being set up there. And a further point that I think is really, really crucial, and it's going to help me pivot to some discussion of the literature, is that political beliefs are a form of identity. They're not, it's not like you have political beliefs in some kind of weird neutral zone and then identity affiliations. Political belief is one part of identity, and particularly since the 20th century. One of the primary assessments that we make when we start talking to someone is what their political affiliation is. It's part of their identity. So, you know, you're 5 minutes into a conversation, you're making lots of assessments, they're not all about politics, but partly you're sitting there thinking, okay, does this person care? Did they vote? Did they vote for Trump? Did they vote for Bernie? Did they vote for Hillary? And you're kind of tick, 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 and you're sort of figuring that out. It might not be fully within the realm of electoral politics. It's just part of the assessment we make of others because political affiliation is such a strongly felt form of modern identity formation. It is just a powerful part of identity. Now, the literary critic Lionel Trilling was keenly aware of this, and in his book, The Liberal Imagination in 1951, he wrote this kind of amazing passage, which I'm going to read to you. "Social class and the conflicts it produces may not be any longer a compelling subject to the novelist, but the organization of society into ideological groups presents a subject scarcely less absorbing. Ideological society has, it seems to me, nearly as full a range of passion and nearly as complex a system of manners as a society based on social class. Now, Trilling here is kind of alluding to the long history of the novel of manners, beginning with like Jane Austen and extending up through Anthony Trollope and E.M. Forster. And what he's saying here is that it might be possible to think of something entirely new, which would be an ideological novel of manners, where you're not focused exclusively on class, but you're focused on how people interact as they come from different political groupings. I think it's a really kind of an astonishing and interesting passage. And that's going to allow me to turn to talk about a few novels. Now, the book has discussion of many novels from the 19th and 20th century, and I've just picked out 3 to say a few very brief words about, to just give you a flavor of some of the readings of the book that are based on this larger argument about bleak liberalism. So I'm going to talk for a minute about Lionel Trilling's own novel, The Middle of the Journey, Ralph Ellison's novel, Invisible Man, and Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook. One thing that's important about these 3 novels and why I chose them too is that they resonate with the claim I made earlier about the intensity of a feeling of challenge and crisis in the post-war era. So Trilling's novel is about a group of political intellectuals. It's set in the late 30s. Its main character is a man named John Laskell, who's a liberal, and who is, at the beginning of the novel, just recovered from scarlet fever, which presumably means a dangerous brush with communism. It's really a little clunky, but gotta love him. He was a literary critic. And there are a couple other very interesting sort of political figures in the book. There's one character, Gifford Maxim, who is thought to be based on Whittaker Chambers, who famously was in the Communist Party and left the Communist Party and became a religious conservative and wrote the very well-known book, Witness. So a lot of things happen in the novel. There's some moral drama. There's really interesting class relations. But the one thing I just want to stress, because it is a fascinating book, and it's been fairly recently reissued by the New York Review of Books publishing team, is that it has this amazing political psychology running all through it. And Trilling is basically showing that liberals and radicals always have prop their identities on one another, that they're, I am not a radical, I'm a liberal, and that it produces these really strange self-conceptions and a tendency to kind of distort the understanding of the other person. And he has kind of really interesting, general characterizations of liberals as being really anxious about being ineffectual, and they're intimidated by radicals. And radicals tend toward righteousness and inflexibility. So it's this kind of very interesting political psychology within this very small sphere that he shows us. The thing is, it's a novel of manners, which means that it's somewhat static. So the main difference between, say, what we might call a social novel, and that a novel of manners is a social novel, and a political novel, is that a social novel always is somewhat static. It's showing society at a certain time in stasis. So Austen is a perfect example of that. Trollope, even in his political novels, is basically writing novels of manners. Political novels, on the other hand, like Dickens's Hard Times or Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, always have an aspiration. They're energized by an aspiration to transform existing society. So this is kind of a really strange and interesting novel because it's all about politics, but it doesn't really try to imagine what the world would be like if liberals and radicals didn't demonize one another, what kinds of practices and policies might ensue. And that, I think, is the more interesting question. Now, the next 2 novels actually do show in a more kind of heightened and interesting way this tension between skepticism and hope, and they're more energized by a kind of political, a direct political energy. Now, Invisible Man, for those of you who saw the recent movie about Baldwin, I Am Not Your Negro, the Invisible Man really resonates with what the kind of, the themes of the Baldwin movie. It's showing the psychodynamics of race relations, the dehumanizing ways in which white America renders the black man invisible or uses him as a kind of symbolic function against which to define himself. And it has a very subtle analysis of forms of power and dehumanization. But throughout the novel, which is highly experimental, there is a kind of frustrated ideal of self-actualization through public speech. That is, the narrator, who is unnamed, is constantly being thrown into or pushing himself into settings where he might be able to effect something through public speech, and he's always thwarted. At the same time, the novel itself becomes this very powerful self-actualization through language, and it therefore helps to present a kind of hope against the bleak sort of anti-Bildungsroman quality of the novel, which is to say the Bildungsroman is the novel of development, and this is a sort of novel where development is constantly thwarted. Yet you do have this achievement of the novel itself and a kind of promise that he's on a threshold at the end. Ellison's non-fictional writings often express this, what I would call this version of bleak liberalism, and in particular his writings on the blues and music. He says, the blues are the only consistent art in the United States which constantly remind us of our limitations while encouraging us to see how far we can actually go. So I would say that he's a blue liberal as opposed to a bleak liberal. Really worth rereading at the present time, as of course is Baldwin. And my last example is Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, known as a feminist and experimental classic written in 1962. I'm just going to describe a really interesting formal feature of this novel, because I think it captures, again, the form that I'm interested in. So there's a frame novel which tells the story of Anna Wolf, who is the main character. She's a writer, she's a feminist, she's been actively involved in a lot of political activities, and she has like very intense psychological dramas. Now, interspersed with this frame novel are a series of notebooks that this same main character has written. There are ultimately 5 notebooks. One of the notebooks is another novel that she's writing. Now, as you read the novel, you think, okay, the frame novel is the stable ontological reality against which these notebooks can be judged. So when there's discrepancies, you think, okay, the frame novel is objective reality, and the notebooks are just her notebooks, so I can reconcile that by understanding that the frame novel is true. But very late in the novel, in what's called the Golden Notebook, it's revealed that the frame novel is actually another novel, okay? Written by Anna, whose first sentence is given to her by one of her lovers. So now so there are 2 different endings. In the frame novel, Anna becomes a marriage counselor and she tutors delinquent kids. So a really good liberal, okay? In the Golden Notebook, she becomes a writer, obviously, because she writes it, the Golden Notebook, and she kind of lives on the edge, psychologically and sexually. So a lot of modernist and postmodernist critics have been thrilled at the invitation to dismiss the ending of the frame novel as banal and liberal and merely fictional and a ruse, and so we can just get rid of it. But my argument would be that it is, and I believe there is evidence throughout the text, and I make the much longer case in the book, that we are being asked to hold both of these endings in tension, that we are not being asked to reject the liberal attitude or the liberal project, that it is utterly important. And I think that in a way it kind of echoes that same doubleness that we saw in Charles Dickens. Okay, because this is the Chicago Humanities Festival, the last point I want to make is I want to say something about the humanities. I'm the director of a humanities institute, so this is just like in my DNA right now. But I do want to say how important it is to think about politics and the humanities and politics in the humanities. You know, one thing I hope that you've taken away from this description of my argument and the project of bleak liberalism is that literature in particular, but also humanities analysis, can help us understand how political commitments are lived. I think this is something that's very important. It's not something that you simply put on when you go to the voting booth. It has to do with how you clarify the values that animate your existence. And that's very important for people to learn while they're in school. Secondly, I think it helps with tendencies to see others as types and to stereotype others. because it produces a nuanced understanding of the relationship between individuals and types. The novel of manners did that brilliantly with class, and of course lots of novelists, reveal biases. That I'm not claiming that novelists are all, perfectly pellucid about political life, but I think it helps to disable the tendency to think of others as mere types and to dismiss them. And it also promotes, really importantly, the humanities promote reflection on value. I think that's one of the most important jobs that they do. And if you want the longer version of that argument, see my TEDx talk. And they're a crucial resource during times of crisis. I talked about a different time of crisis, but I think we're in a time of crisis. And so we need the humanities, and we need the hope that animates a bleak view. Okay, thanks very much.
I really loved your talk. I just got finished reading a book called Sense and Sensibility, C-E-N-T-S, by two guys up at Northwestern, Morrison and Shapiro. And they make the case for the humanities, especially Morrison, who's the literary guy, as eloquently as you have. And they have had the practice of teaching with one another for a long time. And so I'm just wondering, maybe this is sort of an inside academic question, but in your Institute of the Humanities at Brown, what kinds of interdisciplinary dialogue or team teaching do you do so that you can bring about this fertilization, cross-fertilization between the humanities and politics, and to interject into subjects like economics, which in some ways are valueless, the kinds of ethical and moral considerations that they need, especially, as you say, in times of crisis?
Yes, thanks very much for your question, and I'm going to check that book out. As some of you may know, a local professor, Gerald Graff, who taught at the University of Chicago for some time and then moved to UIC in a surprise move, has written a number of books about how best to practice the humanities, but one of his major claims in one of his books, which was called Teaching the Conflicts, was that team teaching was the best way to go because it disabled this notion of a single authority in the classroom, and it helped students to see that there were differing viewpoints, and it would activate their sense of self-clarification. So funny you should ask. So my institute just, this is like a plant question. My institute just inaugurated a new program, a graduate certificate in collaborative humanities, which requires a certain number of courses that all have to be that are all team taught. And one thing that we noticed, partly we were just trying to harness existing energies among the faculty, research energies that were trending towards team teaching to kind of catalyze projects. But we're also introducing into those courses, which are at the graduate level, but I think this can be seeded at the undergraduate level as well, collaborative requirements that the students have to fulfill, so that it's not just the team teaching isn't enough, but the students have to themselves work together and do uncomfortable things like try to both sign their names to the same paper or something like, co-write or co-present. So I think that these processes matter, and in some ways they matter more than the content, But I will say there's a huge challenge in trying to collaborate with the quantitative social sciences. I think it should be done, but it's just the way of thinking is so radically different. But I think, at the very least, it's important for the humanities to show that it can powerfully either augment or criticize other methods outside of itself. It is, in some ways, it's criticism. It's sort of the meta-discipline. the queen of the sciences.
Hi, I was hoping you could clarify something. You were talking about radicals versus liberals. Are you using radicals as synonymous with progressives? And then that'll inform my next question.
No, I'm not.
Okay, so if you could help me understand the differences, that would be great. And then also, you talked about how some parts of liberalism are asking for identities to go away, and that's part of the solution, while there's also this identity politics at play. And one of the major things right now between liberals and progressives is whether or not we need to validate the intersectional differences in our policies and make sure that we have a bottoms-up and margins-in approach. And until we solve that, I don't know that we can actually unify. So if you can just comment on those differences, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay, yes, sure. First of all, I want to make very clear that I am not even remotely anti-radical. Okay, I would like to see the left less divisive. I deeply respect radical politics, but I myself am an avowed liberal. Okay, I think that the basic difference, from my perspective, and mainly I would have to say this is an assessment of a kind of academic context. Though I don't think there's any bright line between academia and activism. There's often much interaction, but I just want to say this, that the radical forms of cultural critique, let's just say, that I would instance here tend to be negative, like fundamentally negative in nature and anti-normative. Right, and that there is a difficulty in presenting any way to move forward. There's a kind of blanket critique of the system. That's one issue that I have with what I would call the radical left in the academy. And I would just say more basically, it's sort of a reform versus revolution distinction. Right? Are you looking for the absolute transformation of existing society? Or do you believe in piecemeal reform? Yes, single payer would be great. Can we get a little closer? Yes, Obama did. That's great as far as I'm concerned. And it's to be expected. That doesn't mean you don't keep pushing for universal health care. Oh, that's just one example. Your second question is great. I mean, it's a really important question in terms of like, what I really like about what you're saying is that you're not predetermining what the outcome of a kind of intersectional process would be, right? But you are, I mean, if I hear you correctly, you're kind of saying we have to postpone any talk of a unified platform. Let's just call it by a kind of convention name. I think that's really interesting. I respect that. That seems quite open-minded to me, but also rigorous in the sense of wanting to be very careful about the breadth of forms of hierarchy and privilege and exclusion that exist. So I don't particularly see that as in any kind of conflict with a liberal approach, what I would call a liberal approach. I do think, though, that, if you're talking about kind of the contemporary political arena, that what is often seen as liberal does need to be pushed from the left. It needs to be pushed.
Thank you. I actually have a very practical question. You're a college professor. You teach humanities. Well, we have a lot of drinking on campus. That's old news. We have a lot of attitude toward the humanities. What am I going to do with this when I graduate? That's also old news. Now we have a deeply political or deeply polarized political and social culture. We have a different kind of media culture than we used to have. And there's a huge amount of emphasis on student loan debt and anxiety over that. What's it like in the classroom right now, you and your colleagues, teaching college professors? I was interested in hearing what your experience is at the moment.
Does anyone else want to take this? I have to say, it's pretty bracing. I feel that I'm at Brown. Brown's a very progressive institution, and it's got a very high energy, active student population. So I will just say one thing that's really interesting. I've been teaching for, I don't know, 26 years. And I have never, until last year, had a syllabus challenged. Like, you know, have someone say, like, your syllabus isn't diverse enough. And honestly, I thought it was great. And it produced, and I think, you know, that while I don't think that the student, you know, whatever, after discussion, there were certain things that the student was unaware of, that it was more diverse than he knew. But at the same time, I thought that the conversation that ensued, and I made some adjustments, and I moved, you know, I had a book by Toni Morrison called Whiteness in the Literary Imagination that was going to be read toward the end of the semester, and I said, you know what, we're reading it next, so that, you know, we've got this on the table right away. And so I think there's a kind of, you know, I think there's real opportunities. I don't think students should be writing the syllabi. I think there's a reason why we're, you know, that professors who've been trained in teaching are writing them. But I do think that, that there's a kind of energy on campus. And you know, another thing I want to say about it being a time of crisis, I think that I predict that, you know, this will be a time that will produce some really great thinking, some really great writing, and some really great art. Because, and you know, I wish we weren't having the problems we're having, but I do think it's going to be powerfully generative, and that it's already producing a highly energized student body, which I think is good for everybody, honestly. Good.
One more. Can you comment on how technology is actually changing the need for the pace of change, and how that relates to like past humanities revolutions or political history? Basically what I'm asking is, how fast do we need to culture change in order to keep up with technological change and come out okay?
Can you just like say a little bit what's behind that, what your view is of the problem?
So if you go to Silicon Valley thinkers, they talk about how all the tech futurists are talking about how you have to basically 10x impact on anything for it to be a worthy investment for technological change. So if you're thinking about 10xing social impact, that might be that we want to lift people out of oppression 10 times faster. And the fact that everybody is totally connected and they can elevate their own issues, even if it's a small minority, has fundamentally disrupted a system where liberals are okay with incremental progress. So that's one of the reasons why we're demanding revolution, because incremental progress has taken 100 years and it's not going fast enough. So as technology continues to connect the world, half of which is still not online, so we don't even know what their issues are really from them, how fast do we need to do this culture change in order to keep up with technology?
Okay. So that's something I haven't thought of. But that's really interesting. I mean, honestly, my first response to that is that it involves a kind of romanticized notion of technology. It's power. I mean, I'm very skeptical that revolution is going to occur through technological means. I just am. I mean, so for that reason, I kind of like refuse the terms of the question. But having said that, like, I do think that it, you know, when you think of the Arab Spring, and you know, there have been instances where technology has been, social media has been really, really important to political movements, but I don't think it's going to be like a Terminator situation. Yeah.
I guess this is sort of feeling my way through that same question. I think part of that is if social media and technology can inflate the strength or artificially inflate the strength of some views, how do you know where the opposition really is and what needs to be addressed? In other words, are the arguments really out there for us to sort of consider and reflect, or are they sort of artificially created? And I think following up on that, it gets the idea of then you know, and I'd like your views on this. So the argument of sort of safe spaces for speech on college campuses, for example, is that like a liberal ideal, or in a way is it sort of not having that speech allowed every place, sort of a limitation on a liberal ideal?
Yeah, okay, those are two great questions. I mean, the first question immediately makes me realize that, you know, that I was viewing your question in the back, you know, in a insufficiently expansive way because of the incredible, you know, just because of the recent issues surrounding influencing political viewpoints via social media in a kind of like creepy disinformation way versus what I was taking you to mean as a more sort of positive, hopeful way. So, you know, immediately considering that, I do feel like, well, wait a minute, there is incredible power to social media. But it kind of reminds me a little bit, actually, the difference between the two questions on the matter of technology. It kind of reminds me of the problem at the heart of George Lakoff's struggling over the question of democratic strategy, because framing involves a certain cynicism. And the democratic, liberal sort of tendency is to have a reflective relation to the attempt to move policies forward, to try to genuinely persuade people to reflectively endorse them and not to simply be sort of controlled by frames, right? So there's a huge challenge, I mean, because I think that one of the most significant and important and laudable aspects of the liberal tradition is this emphasis on reflective endorsement and deliberation, right? So the speed and the kind of soundbite and the 144 character thing, you know, is not necessarily conducive to that, though some of it can be adapted. So I don't have an answer, but that's just an observation. Safe space, I mean, I kind of think that, you know, I would say that it depends on the context, right? I do think there's a really important place for specific sites on campus to be gathering spaces for certain kinds of groups who share avowed identities or commitments or challenges. I think the classroom has to have a kind of different conception of what, you know, of safe space, that I think we have to, you know, in the classroom, I think things sometimes can get very uncomfortable, and we have to all kind of be aware of that and be mindful and be careful and ethical. But I also think it's really, really important to be charitable and to give people the benefit of the doubt, and to not imagine that what they said was said out of because they are the mere conduit of some terrible privilege, you know, and that to try to give people the benefit of the doubt, to try to talk through things. So it's somewhat of a different kind. You know, I think there are different kinds of ways in which we can make pedagogical realms both generative, safe, and, you know, productive, which is another word for generative, by the way.